At 2:47 p.m. on March 6, 1944, the sky over Berlin belonged to the Germans. It had always belonged to them. The capital of the Third Reich sat 600 miles inside enemy territory, wrapped in layers of fighter bases and anti-aircraft guns. The idea that an American single-engine fighter could reach it was considered a fantasy. The laws of physics said no. The fuel calculations said no. The experts said it was impossible. But at that exact moment, Captain Robert Johnson was sitting in the cockpit of a silver P-51B Mustang at 28,000 feet, looking down at the Brandenburg Gate. His fuel gauge was hovering just above half full. His engine was purring, and he was about to make history by proving every expert wrong. The journey to that moment had started 3 years earlier with a plane that nobody wanted and a design that everyone dismissed as worthless. In 1940, the British were desperate. The Battle of Britain was raging, and they needed fighters. Lots of them. They approached North American Aviation with a proposal. Build us P-40 Warhawks under license. We'll pay you. Just start the assembly lines. James Dutch Kindleberger, the president of North American Aviation, looked at the blueprints for the P-40 and made a decision that would change the war. He told the British he wouldn't build their plane. Instead, he designed them something better, and he'd do it in 120 days. The British procurement officers thought he was insane. They thought he was arrogant, but they were drowning, and a drowning man doesn't argue with a lifeguard. Kindleberger assembled a team of engineers in a hotel room in Los Angeles. They worked around the clock, fueled by coffee, cigarettes, and the knowledge that men were dying in England while they drew on drafting paper. They created something revolutionary, a laminar flow wing. Most wings of that era were thick and rounded. They worked, but they created drag. The laminar flow wing was thin and sharp. It sliced through the air like a razor blade. The engineers also mounted the radiator underneath the fuselage in a way that actually created thrust from the hot exhaust air. It was a trick of thermodynamics that turned a liability into an advantage. When the prototype rolled out of the factory in October 1940, it looked fast sitting still. It had an angular, predatory profile. The nose was long and pointed. The canopy sat far back, giving the pilot excellent visibility. It looked mean. But then they installed the engine, and everything went wrong. The engine was an Allison V1710. It was a good engine, reliable, powerful at low altitudes. The Army Air Corps loved it. It powered the P-40 and the P-38 Lightning. On paper, it should have been perfect for this new airframe. But the Allison had a fatal flaw. It couldn't breathe at high altitude. A supercharger is essentially a pump that forces air into an engine. As you climb higher, the air gets thinner. Without a proper supercharger, the engine suffocates. It loses power. It wheezes. The Allison had a single-stage supercharger. It worked fine up to about 15,000 feet. Above that, it started dying. By 20,000 feet, the Mustang with its Allison engine was a sitting duck. It was slow, sluggish, and vulnerable. The problem was that the air war over Europe was being fought at 25,000 to 30,000 feet. That's where the German bombers flew. That's where the Luftwaffe fighters hunted. And at that altitude, the Mustang was worthless. The British took delivery of the first production models in 1941. They were excited at first. The plane handled beautifully at low level. It was fast on the deck. It could turn tight. But the moment they climbed above 15,000 feet, it turned into a brick with wings. The RAF test pilots wrote scathing reports. They called it unsuitable for combat. They said it was dangerous to put a pilot in this plane at high altitude because he'd be defenseless against German fighters. The expert opinion was unanimous. The Mustang was a beautiful failure, so they gave it a job that nobody else wanted. They turned it into a reconnaissance plane and a ground attack aircraft. They sent it to fly low over occupied France, photographing enemy positions and strafing trains. It was dangerous work, but at least the plane was good at something. The U.S. Army Air Forces came to the same conclusion. They tested the Mustang, saw the altitude problem, and rejected it as a fighter. Instead, they hung bombs on it and called it the A-36 Apache. They turned the most aerodynamically perfect fighter design of the war into a dive bomber. It was like using a Ferrari to haul firewood. Meanwhile, back in England, the bomber crews were dying. On October 14, 1943, the 8th Air Force launched a massive raid on the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt, deep inside Germany. The planners knew it would be costly. The target was beyond the range of escort fighters. The P-47 Thunderbolts could only fly to the German border before their fuel forced them to turn back. The bomber crews called it the turn. They watched their little friends waggle their wings and peel away, heading back to England, and then the sky around them became very empty and very dangerous. The Luftwaffe had been waiting for this moment. They attacked in waves. Messerschmitt Bf 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s came in from every angle, firing cannons and rockets. They weren't harassing the bombers. They were slaughtering them. By the end of the day, 60 heavy bombers had been shot down. That's 600 men killed or captured in a single afternoon. The survivors limped back to England with their planes shot full of holes, carrying dead gunners and wounded pilots. The generals looked at the casualty reports and realized they had a problem. The math was brutal. At this rate of loss, they wouldn't have an air force left by Christmas. They couldn't sustain a daylight bombing campaign. The Luftwaffe had built an invisible wall in the sky, and the Americans couldn't break through it. The problem was simple. They needed a fighter that could go the distance. They needed a plane that could escort the bombers all the way to the target and back. They needed range. But every expert said it was impossible. Fighters were small. They couldn't carry enough fuel. The only planes with the necessary range were twin-engine heavy fighters, and those were too slow and clumsy to dogfight with the German interceptors. The solution was sitting right in front of them. They just didn't see it yet. There was a British test pilot named Ronald Harker. In April 1942, he flew the Mustang for the first time. He felt something that the engineers' charts couldn't measure. He felt the balance of the airframe. He felt how the controls responded. He felt how the wing wanted to stay glued to the air. After he landed, he made a suggestion that sounded crazy. What if we took the Merlin engine out of the Spitfire and put it in this American plane? The Rolls-Royce Merlin was a masterpiece. It was a liquid-cooled V-12 with a two-stage, two-speed supercharger. It could breathe comfortably at 30,000 feet. It was the engine that powered the Spitfire and the Lancaster bomber. It was the engine that had won the Battle of Britain. But putting a British engine in an American airframe, the logistics were a nightmare. The engine mounts were different. The cooling systems didn't match. It would take months to engineer. The experts said it wasn't worth the effort. But Rolls-Royce engineers were curious. They pulled a Mustang into a hangar at Hucknall and got to work. They didn't wait for official approval. They just wanted to see if it would work. They cut away the mounts for the Allison engine. They lowered the Merlin 61 into the nose. It was tight. They had to fabricate new cowlings. They rerouted fuel lines and coolant hoses. It was a Frankenstein job, but when they were done, they had created something new. On October 13, 1942, the test pilot fired up the engine. The Merlin didn't roar like the big American radial engines. It had a smooth, high-pitched whistle. The pilot pushed the throttle forward, and the plane didn't just take off. It leaped into the sky. The Mustang with the Merlin engine climbed like it was angry at gravity. It passed 15,000 feet without hesitation. It passed 20,000 feet. It passed 25,000 feet. The engine didn't choke. It sang. When the test pilot landed and the engineers looked at the data, they couldn't believe what they were seeing. The hybrid plane had hit 441 miles per hour at altitude. That was faster than the Spitfire, faster than the Focke-Wulf 190, faster than anything in the sky. The phone lines lit up. The British placed immediate orders. The Americans, who had been ignoring the Mustang, suddenly woke up. General Henry Hap Arnold, the commander of the Army Air Forces, saw the performance numbers and said one word: now. But there was a problem. Rolls-Royce couldn't build enough Merlins. Their factories were maxed out building engines for British planes. If the Americans wanted this magic engine, they'd have to manufacture it themselves. The blueprints were shipped to the Packard Motor Car Company in Detroit. Packard was famous for building luxury automobiles for wealthy businessmen. Now they were going to build the most important engine of the war. Packard took the hand-built British design and figured out how to mass-produce it. They tightened tolerances. They improved bearings. They created the Packard V1650, a license-built Merlin. That was actually better than the original. The factories started pumping out Merlin-powered Mustangs. The new model was designated the P-51B. It had performance that made test pilots grin. But it still had one critical problem. Even with the efficient Merlin engine, the P-51B could only fly about 450 miles before it needed to turn back. That was better than the P-47 Thunderbolt, but it still wasn't enough to reach Berlin. Berlin was 600 miles from England. Round trip, that was 1,200 miles. The engineers did the math over and over. They added fuel tanks in the wings. They put a tank behind the pilot's seat, which made the plane unstable until it burned off. They squeezed every available cubic inch of the airframe. It still wasn't enough. They needed external fuel tanks, drop tanks that could be carried under the wings, used for the cruise to the target, and then jettisoned when the fighting started. The Americans had tried metal drop tanks, but there was a problem. Metal was scarce. Aluminum was needed for building airframes. Shipping thousands of heavy metal tanks across the Atlantic took up precious cargo space on the supply ships. They needed something disposable, something cheap, something that could be manufactured by the millions without using strategic materials. The British proposed a solution that sounded like a joke: make the tanks out of paper. The American ground crews thought it was insane when the first paper drop tanks arrived in England. They looked like giant gray sausages. They were made of laminated craft paper, essentially heavy-duty cardboard, pressed into shape and sealed with animal glue. They were coated with a chemical resin to make them fuel-resistant. The pilots stared at them in disbelief. You want me to fly to Germany with 200 gallons of high-octane gasoline in a cardboard box? The rumors started immediately. Pilots claimed the glue would dissolve in rain. They said the tanks would leak. They said the whole thing was a death trap dreamed up by some bureaucrat who'd never flown in combat. They called them paper bags and death sausages. Some pilots refused to fly with them. But the paper tanks were brilliant. They cost almost nothing to manufacture. They could be made by furniture factories and paper mills, freeing up metal workers to build bombers. And most importantly, they worked. With two 108-gallon paper tanks and internal fuel, the P-51B could fly for 6 hours. That was enough to reach any target in Germany, fight for 20 minutes, and fly home. The range problem was solved. The math had changed. But the Germans didn't know that yet. By early 1944, the 8th Air Force had hundreds of P-51 Mustangs ready. They had warehouses full of paper drop tanks. And they had a plan. The plan was simple and audacious. They were going to launch a massive daylight raid directly on Berlin. They were going to fly right down the throat of the beast. And they were going to dare the Luftwaffe to stop them. The objective wasn't really to destroy factories. The factories were bait. The real objective was to destroy the Luftwaffe itself. The new commanding general, Jimmy Doolittle, had changed the rules. Before, escort fighters were told to stay close to the bombers. Now, they were told to pursue and destroy. They were unleashed to hunt. On the morning of March 6, 1944, the ground crews worked in the cold dawn, wrestling the heavy paper tanks onto the wing pylons of the Mustangs. The smell of gasoline hung thick in the air. The pilots zipped up their flight suits and walked out to their planes. They climbed into their cockpits. The Merlin engines coughed to life, spitting blue flame in the morning twilight. One by one, the Mustangs taxied out and lifted off, pointing their noses toward the rising sun. Over Germany, the radar operators watched the blips forming on their screens. Another American raid. They picked up the phones and alerted the fighter wings. The German pilots scrambled and climbed to altitude. They were relaxed. They'd done this 100 times before. They'd wait for the American escorts to reach their fuel limit and turn back, and then they'd descend on the helpless bombers. But today was different. Today, the escorts didn't turn back. At 25,000 feet over Germany, the American formation kept flying east. The German controllers watched in confusion. The Americans should have turned back by now. They were past the line. They were out of fuel. This had to be a suicide run. But the white contrails kept coming, pointing like arrows straight at Berlin. Inside the Mustang cockpits, the pilots checked their fuel gauges. They were fine. The paper tanks had carried them all the way. Now it was time to fight. The flight leader gave the order, "Drop tanks." Hundreds of pilots reached down and pulled the release levers. The paper tanks tumbled away, falling toward the German forest below. Instantly, the Mustangs jumped, relieved of the weight and drag. They gained 30 miles per hour. The sluggish long-range cruisers transformed into predators. The German pilots, flying heavy Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s loaded with extra cannons for bomber killing, suddenly realized they were in trouble. They were set up for a massacre. Instead, they were about to become the victims. The Mustang's dove. The P-51 didn't just dive, it fell like a stone. The heavy Merlin engine in the nose pulled the plane down to the thin air at terrifying speeds. The airspeed indicators spun past 450 miles per hour, then 500 miles per hour. The scream of the air over the canopy became deafening. The first pass was devastating. The Mustang slashed through the German formation before the Luftwaffe pilots could react. The closing speeds were over 700 miles per hour. The Americans held down their triggers. 6.50 caliber machine guns per plane roared to life, spitting out 75 rounds per second. The results were catastrophic. A Focke-Wulf hit by a solid burst didn't just smoke. It came apart in the air. Chunks of wing, pieces of cowling, shattered canopy glass filled the sky. The German pilots tried to turn and fight, but they were flying trucks against sports cars. The heavy cannons that made them deadly to bombers made them sluggish in a dogfight. The Mustangs danced around them, turning inside their turns, climbing faster, diving steeper. Captain Robert Johnson, leading his flight over the center of Berlin, locked onto a Messerschmitt 109. The German pilot tried to dive away, a tactic that usually worked against Spitfires. But the Mustang stayed with him. Johnson's new K-14 gun sight calculated the deflection automatically. He kept the yellow pipper on the target and squeezed the trigger. The tracers walked into the German engine. Oil sprayed back over the canopy. The Messerschmitt rolled over and plunged toward the streets below, trailing black smoke. Johnson pulled up and looked around. The sky was full of burning planes. Most of them were German. Below, the citizens of Berlin looked up in horror. They'd been told by their propaganda ministers that no enemy fighter could reach them. Now they were watching American fighters twisting and turning over their city, while their invincible Luftwaffe fell from the sky in flames. The dogfight lasted 20 minutes. It was a slaughter. The Mustangs chased the Germans down to the deck. They strafed airfields. They hunted fleeing fighters all the way back to their bases. When the bombers dropped their loads and turned for home, the Mustangs formed up around them. The escort fighters had fuel to spare. They could have stayed and fought for another hour if needed. Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe, was informed that American single-engine fighters had been spotted over Berlin. He refused to believe it. He claimed they must be misidentified German planes. The concept was impossible, but the wreckage scattered across the countryside didn't lie. The paper tanks that littered the German forest were proof. The Americans had done the impossible. The flight home was tense but triumphant. The pilots throttled back, leaning out their fuel mixtures to conserve every drop. They still had 500 miles to go, but the Merlin engines purred smoothly and the fuel gauges held steady. As they crossed the English Channel and the white cliffs of Dover appeared, the tension finally broke. They'd done it. They'd flown to Berlin and back. They'd kicked in the front door of the Third Reich and walked out alive. When they landed, the ground crews ran out to meet them. They didn't look at the pilots first. They looked at the gun ports. The black soot stains around the wing, guns told the story. These planes had been in a fight. The debriefing rooms were loud that night. The skepticism about the Mustang was gone. The jokes about the fragile liquid-cooled engine were gone. The pilots talked with their hands, describing the dives and the dogfights. They talked about the look on the German pilots' faces when they realized the Americans weren't turning back. Word spread through the 8th Air Force like wildfire. The useless plane had just changed the war. Over the next 3 months, the Mustangs returned to Berlin again and again. They hunted the Luftwaffe to exhaustion. The Germans couldn't train new pilots because the Mustangs controlled the skies even over their own training bases. They threw inexperienced teenagers into cockpits and sent them up to fight hardened American veterans. It was murder